Today we're going to begin chapter 4 of the Bhagavad Gita. And before we begin, I'd like to recount a little bit so that we understand the context of moving into chapter 4 of what we spoke about in chapter 3. And also I'd like to remind you that as we do every week, there's an opportunity for you to submit questions. So please submit questions, and if you will write them on the board here so that I can see them, and then I'll try to answer them as we go along. This week's reading from chapter 4 begins. The exalted Lord said to Arjuna, I gave this imperishable yoga to Vivasvat. Vivasvat passed on the knowledge to Manu. Manu taught it to Ishvaku, founder of the solar dynasty. Thus, handed down in orderly succession, the Raja Rishis knew it. With the long passage of time, however, O scorcher of foes, this knowledge of yoga has become greatly diminished on earth. And this thus begins the fourth chapter. Well, in chapter 3, just to set the stage for this, Krishna explained to Arjuna that action and inaction, or you could say inaction, was impossible. Arjuna wanted to ask her, he had asked Krishna, why must I fight this battle? You've been telling me to go within, to renounce outward action and go inward. And now you're asking me to do this outward action to fight this battle. Why must I do that? And Krishna explains to him that it's impossible as long as one is embodied in ego consciousness and in this world, in the world of karma. It's impossible to not act. And so being the case, that inaction is impossible, we must act, but we must act in the right way. We must act in the right spirit. We must perform right, dutiful action. And all men act according to their natures. And so we must act in that way that's dutiful for us. We're each influenced by our inner nature. We're influenced by the gunas. And now the question comes, which is going to be addressed by Krishna, is what is the nature of this right action? He's going to go into this a little bit more deeply. Now, we've already mentioned that right action is that action which is going to take you, me, each individual, according to their own dharma, toward soul freedom. So, but he's going to explore this a little bit more. What does it? What leads to soul freedom? But to set that stage, Krishna backs up a little bit and he puts these teachings into context. And so here he says I gave this imperishable yoga long ago, and he lists the various traditions of how this had been presented over the millennia. Now this is an interesting topic, and it opens up a line of inquiry that I'd like to begin with. Many people because we're in a very, we think of ourselves as perhaps all people do in their times, as their time is very modern. And so we, living in this age of energy and very high technology, we think of ourselves as very exalted and very, very modern. And so we tend to define, because we live in an age of sophisticated technology, certainly compared to the past, we tend to think of technology and invention and all these wonderful marvels of the outer world. We tend to think of progress in those outer terms of if mankind has progressed, because look at all the wonderful inventions that we have and the technological advancements that we have. But when we speak of spiritual progress, the outer is not the measure. And of course, being modern people as we are in this age, we tend to be biased by our view of life outwardly. But in the spiritual realm, you can't say that there is any new modern teaching. I mention that in context because sometimes, or more than sometimes, every year, I think probably the most popular books, when I look at the bestseller list, what are the best sellers that come out every year? nonfiction. Diet books, a new diet. That seems to be the, every year there's a new and improved diet. You know, and or there's some, you know, you could sort of, and people sometimes come out with books about the new way to be successful, the new way to find happiness in life, the new way to understand oneself and get along and progress and outwardly be more successful. And of course, these are fun and these are new, and oftentimes they have some interesting things to share. But when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to wisdom, when it comes to spiritual understanding, is there really a new way? You could sort of say, is spiritual understanding and enlightenment, is it new? Of course not, it's new. This is why it's the teachings are known as Sanatana Dharma. These are eternal religions. Truth is not reinvented from century to century. Truth is eternal, and truth does not change. And it is what is true today will be true 1,000 years from now, a millennia from now. And what is the essential truth right now will be the same essential truth on a planet in a distant galaxy. Truth is eternal, and it's rediscovered, it's experienced, or it's remembered, as the Yoga Sutras say, Smriti. As we develop our consciousness, we remember that which is eternal. And so yoga derives from this tradition. Yoga is a process of you might say, techniques by which we rediscover this truth. So when we study yoga, we need to understand that it's a teaching that is ancient and that has been handed down from ancient times. It's ancient knowledge. And that which Krishna is speaking of in the Gita is also in his time. Here was, what was that, 2,500 years ago. But even then, it was ancient knowledge, even at that time. And it was something that's been passed down from the ancient rishis. This opens up a very interesting topic that I think for us to understand the spiritual tradition of yoga, to understand the spiritual tradition of these teachings, we should put it in perspective. Swami Sri Yukteswar, the guru of Paramahansa Yogananda, wrote a very interesting book which I recommend. It's not an easy one to understand, but it's short. But in the preface or the foreword of the book, introduction of it, he mentions a theory of which is known as the Yuga theory. In other words, he explains how this world, our Earth, our solar system actually, goes through a period of transitionary cycles. That during these cycles we have there's consciousness of mankind as a whole rises and falls, descends and ascends again and again in a certain cyclic pattern, and these are known as yugas. Now in India this is a fairly well-known term, people understand that, but not so much in the West. Although if you look in the ancient traditions of the West, you see that the ancient philosophers spoke of the various ages, the Gold Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. These four ages correspond to the yugas that are spoken of in the East: Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, and the age in which it's commonly thought of that we're now in is Kali Yuga, darkness, the age of darkness. We're in a dark age, is the common understanding in the East. But Swami Sri Yukteswar made an interesting and for his time a rather controversial statement, because it went counter to what popular opinion was saying in that time. Over 115 years ago, he said that the Earth no longer is in this age of Kali, but that we have now transitioned into the second age, Dwapara. Second is what that means. We've entered into this second age of Dwapara. And in his day, so long ago, back in the 19th century, he was criticized quite strongly for this because it went counter to the accepted wisdom. Now, I'm not going to share with you the arguments of why Sri Yukteswar perhaps was right. I feel he was right. And he made very good arguments. And I would refer you to his book known as The Holy Science. You can buy that book and you can read that in the introduction of his reasoning. But what he said was that the Earth itself and the solar system within in which the Earth finds itself cycles about a grand central, what he calls central sun within the galaxy. Now remember, he was speaking of this in 1894. That's when he wrote the book, but of course these thoughts that he was sharing go on before that. And that was at a time when general science knew nothing about galaxies, that we are in a galaxy that's vast in the number of stars that are within it, let alone the idea that there might be other galaxies as well. So he was speaking at a time far ahead of the knowledge that was common, east or west, among astronomers at that time. But he said, we cycle about a great central sun. He referred to this powerful source in the center of this galaxy around which we are cycling. And as the Earth and its solar system cycles around this central source of energy, its orbit wobbles, sometimes taking it closer to that central source of energy, sometimes further away, and again in a wave pattern, as it makes a grand cycle around it. Now, interestingly, astronomers in the decades and in the century after that have confirmed that yes, it's true. Our solar system and our sun and the planets do cycle around this great central source of energy within the galaxy, that central great. Now they speak about a gigantic black hole there at the center of the galaxy, is enormous beyond imagining, sending out rays throughout our galaxy, and it's confirmed that this actually does happen. Well, Sri Yukteswar said our orbit goes in and out in a certain cyclic rhythm of approximately 24,000 years, which corresponds to what we know astrologically and astronomically as the precession of the equinoxes. Now, astronomers explain this precession in various ways, but what Swami Sri Yukteswar said, that this wobble of our orbit around the grand central sun of the galaxy is caused because, as he said, most stars, and such as our sun, have a dual with it, and that we in our solar system are in a dual relationship with another body. And because of that, we cycle around each other, perhaps in a very long rhythm. Now, astronomers have speculated that perhaps our sun is actually a dual star, but none has been found. That dual, although we've looked for it quite vigorously actually by some astronomers, it has yet to be discovered. But nevertheless, whatever it might be in a very long rhythm, Swami Sri Yukteswar said because of this, it causes our sun in its revolution around its dual to go closer and further away from that grand central sun in the galaxy. As it does so, and it approaches closer to that source of cosmic rays, cosmic energy, the general consciousness of man is uplifted. How this should proceed, I cannot explain. I take it on faith that the observation that Swami Sri Yukteswar made is correct. But he said, as we move closer, we are in a more elevated state of consciousness. And as we recede further from that central source of energy, man's consciousness as a whole in our solar system begins to diminish. And as we do, this cycle can be broken up into ascending and descending ages, or as they say in the East, in India, into yugas. And the darkest one, when we're further away from that source of energy, is Kali Yuga, and Dwapara Yuga, and Treta Yuga, and finally Satya Yuga, the more enlightened ages being longer than the less enlightened ages. Again, I refer you to the book for the specifics about that. And Sri Yukteswar went further and said we have actually now come out of that Kali Yuga, which ended about the year 1700, and that the Kali Yuga, ascending Kali Yuga, where we've come out of, lasted for approximately 1200 years. But prior to that, there was a descending Kali Yuga also of approximately 1200 years. So we go down through descending Kali Yuga into ascending Kali Yuga, then to ascending Dwapara Yuga, 2400 years, then Treta Yuga, Satya Yuga, where then again it begins to descend, Satya, Treta, Dwapara, Kali, again and again and again. And these teachings of the Vedas, the teachings of yoga, these descend from an age that is higher than what we are now, when man's consciousness was more refined than it is now. We measure, in our age, we measure refinement and progress by technology. That just happens to be a bias of the material mind which rules the Kali Yuga. But in higher ages, material expressions of consciousness were not necessarily the measure. It was one's knowledge of inward realities. Swami Sri Yukteswar said that as mankind begins to move out of this dark age, which has the capacity of man's general capacity is one to only understand things in terms of material realities, material dogmatic forms, that we will begin as a whole to perceive subtler realities. And in Dwapara Yuga, being an age of energy, characterized as, that we will begin to perceive subtler energies. And if you look at history, isn't it interesting, about 1700 scientists began to make great discoveries. They began to see that, yes, there were subtler realities, that science itself in the Western mold began to be developed. Newton and many of the great scientists that followed him after that time. And the concept of energy itself began to become current in the world as a whole. The idea of energy was not something that, particularly in the West at least, was not something that was a reality for people. In the East, of course, there has been an ancient tradition of energy, but known as prana, and this is what we speak about when we speak about energy in yoga. But that too, that was in decline for the last 1,500, 2,000 years. That knowledge too began to be lost. And in our age, now that we've moved into the Dwapara, beginnings at least of Dwapara Yuga, this knowledge of energy, this awareness that there are subtler realities is becoming current once again. Science itself looks at matter, and around shortly after Sri Yukteswar's time, the great scientist Einstein postulated that energy and matter are equivalent. E equals mc squared, that matter is simply a grosser vibration of energy. And in the years to come, the centuries to come, perhaps it's better to say, mankind will begin to realize that energy itself is not the ultimate reality, that there is even a more subtle reality behind energy. And the energies that we perceive now, electricity, nuclear energy, magnetism, these types of things will begin to, our understanding will begin to expand about them, and even subtler realities will be discovered in this age that we're in, little by little by little. But remember, in every age though, whether it's Kali Yuga, Satya Yuga, all of the ages are represented. There will be people of high understanding, even the darkest of ages. And so it is, even, you must understand that even in the highest of ages, there are people of darkened understanding as well. So this is a general description of what consciousness of the general level of consciousness as we pass through these ages. So yoga has descended from a high age, and it's being reawakened again now in this age as we're moving into Dwapara. I find it very fascinating to consider that Krishna was giving these teachings of yoga at the very tail end, according to Sri Yukteswar's calculations. He was the very tail end of descending Dwapara Yuga. And even in the traditional way of looking at the yugas, it's said that Krishna came right at the end of Dwapara Yuga, and then we were passing into Kali Yuga at that time. And now we're coming out of that. And so what do you see in the world today? You see a reawakening of an interest in these spiritual teachings, a reawakening in this interest of yoga, which is spreading throughout the world today. I find that quite interesting. And it's also a reason explained by the masters of our path of why Kriya Yoga is being reintroduced in the world at this particular time. Because what is Kriya Yoga? It's an exploration of energy in the body. It's learning to become aware of that energy in the body and then being able to control that energy and be able to direct that energy upward. But remember, control follows awareness. Awareness precedes control. So first we must become aware. And in an age of energy, this is exactly what Sri Yukteswar said. Mankind as a whole will begin to be aware of subtler energies around them in the world, but also subtler energies within us. And because of that, Kriya Yoga is the perfect science to be in tune with this reawakening of consciousness in this Dwapara Yuga. So, coming back, Krishna has said that I gave these teachings long ago to these teachers and to these others. And this teaching has descended from sage to saint to disciple again and again throughout the ages, been passed down. I think it's also, it reminds me of that beginning of the autobiography of a yogi, that where Paramahansa Yogananda says what has sustained the culture of India throughout the millennia. And he says it's twofold. There's twofold reasons. It's individuals' quest and to explore eternal verities. The desire for truth has been continual and fostered in the Indian culture throughout the millennia. And secondly, Paramahansa Yogananda says it's the disciple-guru relationship. This too has been fostered, and from disciple to guru, age after age, this has been able to sustain the tradition of India throughout the millennia, whereas other societies have come and gone because they haven't had that tradition. This is something that will continue to sustain the culture as long as you have those two, each individual seeking truth and also the guru and disciple relationship. And so this is where Krishna begins. Now, I'd like to continue. He then goes on. Today I have taught you, my devotee and friend, that ancient science of yoga, the secret to the highest blessings for mankind. And then Arjuna says, although before I say, I'd just like to reference here, he says, today I have taught you my devotee and friend. Notice how he addresses Arjuna as his friend. Paramahansa Yogananda said that of all the relationships between people, husband, wife, lover, beloved, father, son, mother, daughter, there's also that relationship of friend. And he said of all the relationships, he valued friendship the most because he said it was the most pure. Pure in the sense because with true friendship, there's no compulsion. There's no, you might say, inborn expectation of reciprocal return. We as a mother and a child, there's a certain instinct, you might say, there of that naturally the mother cares for the child, the father for the son. But in friendship, it's a free gift. And in that sense, he felt it was the most pure. So notice how Krishna here addresses him, with that. But then Arjuna says, Vivasvat lived in far-off antiquity. You, however, were born recently. How am I to take this statement that it was you who first taught the sacred yoga to mankind? And then Krishna replies, the Blessed Lord said, many have been my births, and many also yours. I remember all of mine, though you remember yours not. I remember mine, but you don't remember yours. Why is that? Why don't we remember our past lives? Here Krishna has been saying, I've come again and again and again. But I remember all of my past lives. Now, this, of course, there's something larger that's being implied in this statement. He says, I've come again and again. Krishna was an avatar. Now, that is a whole subject to itself, which I'm going to leave mostly to next week. We're going to explore that in more depth. But the great masters of many traditions, they come again and again and again. But they can remember, but we can't. Why is that? It's attachment. You could say we don't have perspective. Krishna was able to perceive his past lives because he saw his present life in perspective, or that present incarnation, that role that he was playing at that time, in perspective to all the others that he had played. Whereas we do not see it in perspective. You might say, if I take a coin from my pocket and I put that coin right up in front of my eye, what can I see? I see the coin only. I can't see everything else. It's only if I can take that coin and put it further distant from me, I can see that coin in relationship perhaps to all the other coins that might be in front of me at that time. So it is with us, and that we lose that perspective when we become so fixated upon that which is right before us close. And so we become very fixated upon this life that we're living right now. And the root of that fixation is attachment. There's in the Yoga Sutras, when we study the Yoga Sutras, we study the topic of Yama and Niyama in Raja Yoga. One of the yamas is non-attachment or non-greed, or the non-acceptance of gifts, as some have even interpreted that. But it's not being attached to anything. And what is the most basic of attachments that we have? It's being attachment to this personality and this ego, this sense of I am, and give yourself, then fill in your name at that point. This is who I am. And we're very attached to that. And to the degree that we're attached to this particular ego, this particular identity, and this particular personality that we have, to that degree, it clouds out all of our vision of something larger. That we don't see ourselves as who and what we really are. We begin to see ourselves in this limited form. And only when we can begin to withdraw ourselves from that ego identity, what happens then? We say, I'm not that, but yet I played that role. And when we can see it in that sense, then we can see all the other roles from all the many other incarnations past. We begin to see them, I was the pirate, I was the sailor, I was the businessman, I was the housewife, I was the secretary. Whatever it might be, we begin to see that perspective. Paramahansa Yogananda, in his poem Samadhi, he said, I, the cosmic sea, watch the little ego floating in me. It's not that the ego disappeared, but it's simply a memory. It's simply a memory, and that ego, you can begin to see it, all the different roles it began to play. And this is the power you could say, that comes from the perfection of that yama of non-attachment. As we know, each of those yamas, niyamas, in their perfection, they have a certain power that manifests, and that's that ability to remember past lives is the one associated with that non-attachment. Now, somebody is asked, a question has come in. He says, does this mean that Krishna's teachings come from Manvantara, from different ages, from different cycles? And the answer is yes and no. Yes, but mostly yes. You could say also, I say yes and no because it reminds me of a question that was asked of Paramahansa Yogananda. He had come into this world with a special mission to reawaken, as he said, the ancient teachings of yoga as expressed in the Gita by Lord Krishna. And so as he shared these teachings, one of his disciples asked him the question, is this a new religion? And Master said, no, it's not a new religion. It's a new expression. And I think this is the same thing that can be applied to any of the great masters, any of the great avatars that come. And of course, I'm jumping ahead here to a topic we're going to go into further next week. The avatar comes, the great masters come again and again to share with us the ancient teaching, which does not change. It's what Krishna spoke of is exactly the same that applies to us today. It was no different then, but the outer expression, whether it's our time, whether it's Krishna's time, or whether it would have been in the time of Manu, long before him, it's the same teaching. But so it derives again and again and again. And 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years from now, it'll express itself again. But each time it does, it has to be expressed in a culture, in a time, in a framework that is appropriate for those teachings at that time. Take Christ's teachings, for example. Christ, and as Yogananda explained, he said his teachings were basically the same as well. But the culture and the milieu in which he found himself, Christ found himself, he expressed a certain aspect of those teachings in a particular way. And so it is with all the great ones that come down. They all refer back to that central diamond, but yet they approach that central, the light to that central diamond from a particular facet that is going to be appropriate to be able to reach the people in the age that he finds himself. As I said, we're going to go into this a little bit more next week, but our particular masters of this path of Kriya Yoga have played their part in this role, as in this large cosmic drama again and again. Paramahansa Yogananda made a very interesting statement in this regard. He said that Babaji had said that he was an incarnation in his past life. One of his past lives, he had been the incarnation of Krishna. He had played that role. And isn't that interesting? Because Krishna, and Master making such an emphasis on his role, his mission in life, was to reawaken these teachings of the original teachings of the Bhagavad Gita in this age. And in following that statement about Babaji being Krishna in a past life, Yogananda told his disciples that in a previous life he too had been with Krishna. He had been Arjuna in that past life. And that it was as Arjuna was the disciple of Krishna receiving that, so too was Master in this life receiving that inspiration from Babaji. And it was at the command of Babaji that Paramahansa Yogananda was to take these teachings, this new expression of these ancient teachings, out into the world again, by coming to the West at first, but then ultimately these teachings are meant for the world at large. And so I find this very fascinating, that we live in a time when of particular portents, that it's a very significant time. I see another question is going up on the board now. Let me see, and I'll answer it, and then we'll come to an end this week. Can the relationship with God be considered as an intimate relationship? With our own higher self? Yes, there's a philosophical truth to that, because God, we project God, we see God outside of ourselves, we think of God outwardly, and we give God form, we speak of it that way. But you could also say, and it's valid, God's our own higher self, and we even project who is the true Guru. God is the Guru. God, our own higher self, is the Guru. But yet, this is a philosophical concept which is difficult for many people to grasp, and it's easier in many ways. And it's not that one is true and one is not true. They're both true, because we can also find that as you might say, the devotee projects the divine outwardly, to have that I and thou relationship, which is very sweet. And you find that thinking strictly in terms of the higher self, although there's a philosophical truth to that as well, I think there's something about us as humans that also wants to have that outer relationship, and that the soul itself craves that relationship of I and thou. It fulfills the heart in that way. And there's a truth to that as well. This is as if you studied philosophy, which if you ask that question, you probably have, you know that through the centuries there's always been this debate. Is it dual? Is it non-dual? Is God personal? Is God impersonal? And I think the best answer is it's both. God, we make God personal to us because then we can love that. We can express love in a personal way. And so we see God outwardly as our mother. We see God outwardly as our father, or as I said, we see God outwardly as our friend, and it allows us to have that relationship. If that in a higher cosmic sense, once we have attained that reality that there is no duality, it's all one, that I, in that cosmic vision, that actually I am that. Isn't that tat tvam asi? That I am. That being the ultimate reality, that too is true. And I think this depends upon our inner nature. Some of us relate in one way, some of us relate in another. But I find objectifying it outwardly, although I know that there's a non-dual inward presence to that, I find it more sweet that way. And I in my path I talk to God. I talk to God as Guru. I talk to God as my friend. I talk to God as my Divine Mother. And inwardly this conversation goes on, and I often ask myself, Jaya, who are you talking to in there? And I said, well, I'm talking that conversation that is going on in all of our minds, if you look closely within. And I said, and I've identified, I'm talking as God. I'm talking to God. I'm talking to Divine Mother. I think of it in that way. But maybe in the ultimate analysis, it's my higher self as well. I think both are true, and you can think of it in both ways. And finally, one more question, and I'll leave it at that. In the Hindu tradition, one of the samskars of the child's first visit to the temple, where the child is introduced to the divine parents. What stage is the child? Okay, it's a long question. Keep the questions short, and I think this program will go better. Okay, it says in the Hindu tradition, one of the samskars of the child's first visit to the temple, where the child is introduced to the divine parents. What stage is the child introduced as the divine as friend? I think it's natural when a child is very, very young. Of course, what is important in the child's life? It's the child's parents, and of course we begin to see that as a child. Look at the natural development of a child. A child then begins to become aware, not just of himself or herself, but becomes then aware of the parents. And that relationship is all perhaps there is in that child's life. But as a child matures, they begin to see there's a larger reality as well. There's a larger reality of others. And when that larger reality begins to develop, you then begin, the child very naturally in their own life, they begin to make friends. They have expanded their sympathies beyond the small circle to something larger. Now for each person it might be a little bit different. You have in the tradition of Krishna, Radha, Krishna, the disciple, the teacher, the lover, the beloved. For many this resonates very strongly. But I don't think there's any specific point at which one can begin to identify God as one's friend. But it certainly would come at a time when a child is aware that there is something larger in the world. Their relationship with the world is seen more through a lens that's larger than just seeing their mother and their father. And perhaps then they see their brothers and sisters, but eventually they begin to see the world beyond that. But there's not one is better than the other. Master said he appreciated friendship because he saw it as very pure that way. There's no compulsion. It's not, you might say, colored by the human relationships of family. So I don't know if there's a right time or wrong time. It's based upon an individual's and particularly a child's natural inclinations. So next week, as I said, we're going to go a little bit further into this discussion of the avatar. I think all of you know that very famous phrase, Krishna says, "I come again and again when virtue declines. I reincarnate to uplift my devotees," and we're going to explore that stanza. Many blessings to you, and I hope to see you, or through this lens, I hope to be able to discuss with you this great scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, next week.